Hey everybody, how's it going?
Hey, Jake.
All right, thanks everybody for coming tonight. It is Tuesday, November 4th, election day, and you're here at Surly for our November section meeting. So thanks for coming. We got some great speakers talking about some really cool stuff. But first, I'm going to give it to Nick to give us some section updates, and then we'll get into it. So thank you. Yeah, there's like 5 people. Oh.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, AJ. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nick Costello. I'm this year's NCITE president. I'd like to welcome all you to our November section meeting here at Surly. Thanks for taking time out of your day on election day to make it over here to Surly. If you intended to vote, I hope you maybe did so earlier this morning. But if you still need to do so, I think there'll be time after this to make it over to your polling place. We're excited to be here at Surly. This is a venue that we haven't used before, and obviously, I mean, you can see how cool of a spot this is. So exciting to be here, and we're looking forward to the presentation today from Paul and Maurice. So just want to do some quick introductions, go around the room here, do our usual introductions. So just state your name and employer, your current role with NCITE if you have one, and then the question of the day today. So seeing as it was Halloween last Friday, I thought, what was your Halloween costume this year? And I know we're all adults, so there's probably a lot of people here that did not dress up for Halloween. So I'll also accept what was the best costume that you saw someone else wearing this year? Or if you're one of those weirdos who locked yourself in your basement and turned off all the lights and you didn't see anyone else in a costume, what is what's your favorite or your most memorable costume from when you were growing up? So I'll start. Again, Nick Costello with Washington County, this year's NCITE president. I did not dress up this year. My daughter was trying to convince me to be one of like the bad guy from K-pop Demon Hunters. But I did not end up doing that, sadly for her. But when we were out trick-or-treating, my favorite outfit that I saw, or my favorite costume that I saw was, there was like a 10-year-old girl who was dressed as a Costco sample person. So had like the full garb, like hairnet, glasses, a tray with individual baby carrots on it. So I thought that was pretty creative. Go right here.
All right, Paul Morris with SRF Consulting Group, speaking tonight, and we're on Fox 1Z.
Hello, I'm Maurice Roers. I work at MnDOT. I am not a member of NCITE, but I'm one of the presenters tonight. And I'm a little bit biased as well. I did not dress up, but my son, his costume this year was like a large trench coat that we kind of put some scaffolding in. And so his head was coming out the middle, and we pinned the arms, like he was holding his head, and it was headless up here. It was a pretty good costume.
Bontakari Trillion, Q for short, with Align Engineering. And this year I was the Fauché Tower.
Ray Hayers, transportation planner with Kinley Horn. I did not dress up for Halloween, but my 14-month-old son dressed up like a farmer, and then our lab was dressed up like a Highland cow. It was pretty sweet.
Hello, Amy Morone with the City of Bloomington. I did not dress up this year, but the favorite costume that I have made in the past few years was a very glamorous peacock. It was a lot of work.
I'm Derek Fender with TKDA, and the best costume that I saw was a unwanted candy vending machine where you insert your unwanted candy and get better candy back. I don't know if I can top that.
Justin Siebens, SRF Consulting, this year secretary. We dressed up as a family as Harry Potter this year, so I was Dumbledore.
Hey everyone, Jack Olson with Kinley Horn. I am NCITE's webmaster. My costume this year was, I broke out my Nemo onesie. I bring it out every year. It's easy to put on and off, so used it again this year.
Hello, I'm Sarah Peterson with HDR, this year's treasurer. And this year, me and my family dressed up as Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And we put a gold wig on our Labrador because he's always trying to eat everyone's food.
Hello, everybody. I'm Morgan Nelson with Kinley Horn. I'm the North Central Section's representative to the Great Lakes District Board, as well as on the District Communications Committee. And if you have heard the song Chicken Banana, if you have a small child, you may recognize it. If you don't, please don't Google it, it'll be stuck in your head. But I was banana and my husband was a chicken, and our 2-year-old daughter loved it.
I'm Finley with Stantec. My kids are too old to go trick-or-treating now. One of the iconic costumes that my wife made, my son was all black and had a black cardboard pyramid and a big eye. And he was the Illuminati. So he got a lot of second looks.
I'm Maddie Fiddler from Stantec, and I dressed up as the old guy from the movie Up, Mr. Fredrickson, with a cane in it.
Hi, everyone. Cool. Josh Palmetier here with SEH. Paul and I were twins this year. I also wore a Fox onesie.
Blake Ander, SCH, on the co-chair of the Under Bumper Committee, and my Halloween costume this year was a disco dancer.
Tyler Craig, Dakota County. I am the chair of the Intersection Traffic Control Committee. My wife went as Wednesday Addams, and I went as Thing, and I just did like a full bodysuit and just had my hand be Thing the whole time.
Jonah, Jonah from Street Logic Pro. My favorite costume, my stepson years and years ago, we made him a transformer where he could lay down and be a car and then stand up and turn into a transformer. Way too much work, but was quite a hit.
Gus Perrin, WSB. My daughter dressed up this year. I did not. She was a little parrot, 11 months old. It was adorable.
Jeff Hilton, TKDA. Our neighborhood doesn't get too many kids, so the neighbors eat in the driveway, consume refreshments. And this year I was a red M&M with red sunglasses and a 38 horsepower stump grinder, which I had rented earlier that day to complete the install.
AJ Fisher, assistant traffic engineer at Dakota County and director this year with NCITE. This year for my costume, I was a frog at the request of my 3-year-old son. So.
Stacia Judabin with TKDA, and my favorite costume I saw this year was a set of sisters dressed up as pig and their little brother dressed up as a little wolf.
Scott Moscow with Align Engineering. This year I dressed up with my German Lederhosen at my daughter's hockey tournament. It was a hit at the hotel.
Matt Pacino with TC2. I had the pleasure of not going outside for Halloween for the first time in 12 years, chasing my kids. So that was excitement. But my favorite costume actually was my oldest son. His 2 friends went as carrots. He went as a bottle of ranch.
Phil Cools with SRF, this year's past president. This year I sat outside around a fire, handing out candy. My favorite costume was a little Caddyshack. The kid was in the wagon, go for a hat and you like the green around him, just a little Caddyshack over it.
Joe Gustafson, Washington County, 2016 past president, I believe, and I'm still the METCD committee rep for NCITE. This year I was dressed up as a person who was horribly sick and trying to recover from a terrible illness that was getting passed around the office all week. So in the words of Buck Owens, all I had to do was act naturally. So I stayed in and watched Game 6. Wish I hadn't.
I'll stick with the baseball theme. I'm Tim Thoreen with HR Green, and my getting old enough or don't need me. So I was wearing a Seattle Mariners hat. I had the joy of going to Game 5 with the Mariners against the Blue Jays. If you recall that Grand Slam, awesome game, super stoked. Went out and bought a Mariners hat, and then I was all into it. And then I got to be for Halloween a disgruntled Mariners fan instead of a disgruntled Twins fan. So that was my change.
Hi, I'm Dan Rodolfo from Kimberly Horn. I did not dress up this year, but a number of my coworkers dressed up as Pitbull.
Jacob Royer with Kimberly Horn. Me, my wife, and our 8-month-old daughter went as Ghostbusters this year.
Justin Sear with Alliant. I was Luke Danes, and I pushed around my 16-month-old daughter as a UPS driver.
Zach Ike with HDR Engineering. This year we all went as superheroes. My daughter was Spider-Man, my son was Superman, and I got to go as Flash.
Carl Hallstrom, Development Engineering. This year my fiance and I did the CEO couple that got caught at the cult.
Hi, Tim Cox, I'm with Kimberly Horn. I was jealous of my brother's costume this year, who went as Cal Naughton from Talladega Nights with the full racing suit and Fu Manchu and everything.
All right, thanks everyone. So just a quick sorry about that. Just a quick few thank yous before I get into a few announcements. So thank you to Alliant Engineering for being our meeting sponsor tonight. Thank you to Surly for hosting us, but just a quick plug for Surly. So this room on Tuesday nights, they do a nonprofit Tuesdays. So if you're a qualifying organization, you can get this space. Basically, there's no the rental fees waived, and there's no food and beverage minimum. So thanks a ton to Surly. We probably wouldn't be able to do this space and keep costs down if it wasn't for them doing that. And then certainly thanks to MnDOT and SRF for being here to present tonight. A few NCITE announcements. So for NCITE members, being election day today is a good reminder. Our election is currently going on for our executive board for next year. And it actually closes this Friday at 5 o'clock. So for those of you who haven't voted, please do so this week. And make sure to check your other or your junk folders. We've heard reports of several people not getting their emails from Election Buddy. So there was a reminder email that went out yesterday at like 11 a.m. So check if you haven't seen anything. If you still haven't seen anything, feel free to reach out to me. And then just a plug for our annual meeting is coming up quick here. It's actually next Friday, not far from here at Smash Park in Roseville. And I think most of you have probably been to an annual meeting before, but it's a blast. It's kind of our year-end celebration, banquet, heavy apps this year, and then an awards presentation, socializing, networking, and a bunch of fun games. So Smash Park has its indoor pickleball, bean bags, duck pin bowling, karaoke, and there's some other stuff too. So The more the merrier, should be a lot of fun. Make sure to get signed up for that this week because registration closes next Monday. And then last but not least, I just wanted to put in a plug or save the date for next year. Great Lakes District and ITE International are doing a joint meeting in Detroit from July 19th through the 22nd. So just wanted to get that on people's calendars. It's a good opportunity to, it's not right in our backyard, but it's a short flight to be able to make it to both conferences. So just wanted to get a save the date out there. And that is it. I think I will turn it over to Caitlin to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Hey, thanks everyone for coming. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. Maurice Roers is the Director for Planning and Policy within MnDOT's Office of Sustainability and Public Health. Within this role, Maurice is responsible for developing processes and procedures to implement the state's greenhouse gas emission legislation as it relates to the transportation sector. Prior to working at MnDOT, Maurice served in a variety of planning and public administration roles, ranging from Metro Transit in the Twin Cities, the Department of City Planning in New York, and the Department of Conservation in New Zealand. As SRF's Director of System and Policy Studies, Paul Morris and his team use a wide variety of models, data sources, and analyses to help clients address their most challenging transportation issues. For the first several years of his career, Paul's focus was on travel demand modeling to produce traffic forecasts for planning and projects. Since then, he has led projects featuring economic evaluation, multimodal travel, mode shift, demographics, VMT, and GHG emissions. Please join me in welcoming Maurice and Paul.
Let's see where we go from here.
There you go. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. And I like how we have kind of confusing presenters in that I'm Morris and it's Paul Morris. And I once worked with a guy like Andrew James. I don't know if anybody remembers from Met Council, but to this day, I don't know if he was James Andrew or Andrew James. Like the double first last name is always a challenging thing. So we have to keep it straight. So I'm at MnDOT and as mentioned, work in the Office of Sustainability and Public Health. Newish to MnDOT, newish to this work, and so I'm grateful to be kind of co-presenting with Paul, who has had a little bit of a longer history in terms of some of the work that I'm discussing tonight was the outgrowth of a working group that MnDOT had convened on this topic and gotten some advice, and Paul had been involved in that. So anyways, tonight we're going to talk about a few topics. I'm going to just briefly go over the legislative background that kind of puts us in the frame relative to this topic. I'll talk a little bit about flowing from that legislation, some of the assessment procedures that we've developed, and this would apply to new expansion projects. So, you know, as a lot of consultants in this room, you'd be interested in how this might apply to work coming your way. We'll then transition to Paul, and Paul will chat a little bit about some of the modeling implications and modeling work that he's been involved in. And then we'll flip back to me and I'll talk about some offset procedures. So we have some guidance on how to assess the impact of projects, and they also have some guidance on how to identify offsets. So just to put this topic into a little bit of perspective, this work flows from state legislature. And even though the specific legislation that we're working off of was kind of adopted in 2023, the history in Minnesota actually goes back about 15 years. So, you know, in the mid 2000s, the state passed legislation around trying to decarbonize. And at that point, it was really focused around the electricity network. And there were a number of initiatives that kind of studied and tried to build momentum. And then in 2019, there was a report that really kind of crystallized that and gave some profile momentum to work that eventually ended up at the legislature, where in 2023, they adopted a standard in terms of trying to move to net zero around carbon emissions across a whole number of sectors. And then as a part of that, they also instituted a couple objectives for MnDOT, which was to both assess the impact of projects, and then in 2024, they identified that they also wanted to look at the kind of portfolio suite of projects. So the work that I've been engaged in, and Paul's been assisting with as a consultant, has been trying to kind of bring life to that legislation. This slide just talks about real briefly some of those statutes. I won't read them word for word, but again, those first three statutes are kind of describing that they're trying to reduce emissions across all sectors. It talks about the Transportation Commissioner setting a goal for the transportation sector, and then looking about how we assess expansion projects. And then that fourth one was a year later, they set up this technical advisory committee to help advise on that work and also applied it to a portfolio of projects. So one of those, the first 2 points, I'll dwell briefly on it because the work that I'm going to be describing as it relates to the assessment procedures, it's kind of nested within this objective of reducing emissions across the states to net zero by 2050. So that's kind of the target that the state is aimed at. And as a part of that work, the commissioner was tasked with giving targets to the whole of the state in the transportation sector. And if we're at this point now, in 5 years' time, 5 years after that, what would it look like to reduce our emissions? And so the kind of top black line that's on the graph is kind of showing emissions as they are. And that's generally is forecast to be going down due to improvements in the fleet composition, more electrification, more efficient vehicles. And so the projection is that that would be decreasing over time, but that improvement in efficiencies doesn't get us to that net zero point. And so that bottom line is kind of showing progressively, if we were to kind of move towards net zero, what's the gap between where we're kind of projected to and additional work that we want to do. And so those gap essentially was apportioned out to the state as targets for like each region. And then those regions that I'm referring to, like each MPO has a target, and then some of the geographic regions that sit outside of that have their own targets. We have a target for non-surface transportation and also some surface transportation that sits outside of that, but that's how the goals were divided up. And so when I talk a little bit about later on moving to a portfolio approach, that is what we're aimed at. How do we look at our transportation investments overall, and how are they contributing to that reduction in carbon across time? But as mentioned, one of the first things that we were tasked with doing was looking at our expansion projects. So the kind of portfolio work is upcoming work that we haven't solved yet. The first thing that the legislature asked us to do was at least set up a way of assessing expansion projects. And so that's in the main what I'm going to talk about tonight, noting that this work on the portfolio is kind of coming down the track. As transportation professionals, you probably understand this, but a lot of people in the general public kind of know this, but then it's also kind of counterintuitive. So a lot of emissions, particularly as it relates to expansion projects, come from induced travel effects. So this is a little bit of a diagram that kind of shows the concept that kind of sits behind the legislature's thinking on this. We have some emissions that when a project is first built related to the construction of it. We actually get some gains initially at the front of a project where you get the traffic network working more efficiently. There's less congestion, and therefore you see emissions going down. But in time, you'll see that capacity expansion actually just draws more traffic to it and results in more emissions. And that's even taking into account kind of anticipated population growth. We find that if you increase the capacity, that you will have an increase in demand for it. And talking to Justin earlier from SRF, who for a brief period of time lived in Brooklyn Park, where I grew up, and we've seen this all the time. Like we build a road, it's relieves capacity or congestion for a moment, but then suddenly we're kind of surprised by how quickly it fills up, and people are generally able to travel longer distances, and so oftentimes we'll take advantage of that and drive more than they might have otherwise had that capacity not been there. And what MnDOT had spent the last year and a half doing was trying to kind of validate, okay, how would we assess more expansion projects? And they relied on a number of consultants, in particular, ICF was one of the groups that advised us quite a bit, that was looking at this induced travel demand, did a lot of review across different research that had been done. And then they kind of came to a strong basis that there is evidence that has for induced travel as a real thing. And there's kind of consistent findings across a number of studies going back the last 30 years that kind of give average factors of what that is. And MnDOT has then now applied that to kind of urbanized areas to rural areas as we've done this work. Now, the quirk with our current processes, in which there is a bit of fuzz, and that relates to that squiggly line there, is that a lot of this stuff is at a network level. And tasked initially because they thought it would be easier, like, oh, we won't have you do everything at once, we'll just start out with projects. Well, it's kind of hard to do an exact one-to-one translation between what is that kind of a network effect onto an individual project. So we recognize that there's a little bit of squishiness there, but in the main, again, those travel effects kind of bear out. Now, Paul will probably support me on this because I'm not a traffic modeler, and so I'm going a little bit on my depth. But one of the things that's also kind of new, particularly for the transportation community, is like, well, we do these travel demand forecast models, and the guidance that I'm going to talk about is kind of doing a model that's just based on an elasticity equation. And you're like, what? This is like such a different method. They're actually just two different things coming from different perspectives looking at the same thing. So the elasticity method that I'm going to be talking about is kind of based on looking at past projects, and that's that research that I was talking about that has identified the induced travel effect, and then travel demand forecast models are looking in the forward. And historically, models have been good at the top things that are on the slide, but they haven't been so good at capturing some of the effects, the factors that are described at the bottom end of this slide. And so that that elasticity model, that is better at capturing some of the effects that travel forecast models we know don't do well at. In time, we're seeing this convergence between some of the induced travel research and the elasticity method and travel demand forecast models. But at present, the models are not one-to-one. And so that's why MnDOT has kind of done this double-barreled approach that I'll describe in a moment. And then in addition to the kind of those research studies that I was describing, we've also looked at and been in partnership with a lot of our sister agencies across the country and kind of looking at what is the work that they're doing and have taken some kind of best practice from them. So here's just a smattering of what some other state DOTs have been doing. To be fair, Minnesota is unique. Like there's no other state that has this specific legislation. California, Colorado, Oregon, they're kind of doing elements of this to a certain degree, but also we're breaking new ground. And so, equally, this is this is new, and we're also trying to figure out what is a great approach. So the assessment guidance that I'll talk about in a second has been, in addition to that kind of consultants that have been supporting us and internal staff, there was a technical advisory committee that got set up about a year ago to advise the commissioner on this guidance. So here's this kind of composition of some of those individuals. It was purposely intended to draw on some state entities that have a role in this, such as MnDOT, Med Council, MPCA. But then we also have, city and county representation, people that kind of more represent rural areas and greater places in outstate Minnesota. And then people that are involved in active transportation. And then some of you may recognize the name at the bottom there, Robert Nolan. He's a longstanding transportation researcher based at Rutgers University. And some of the studies that are in the literature review, he was the author of. All right, so I'll talk briefly about the guidance that we've developed for assessing expansion projects. And then again, I'll kind of pause to Paul is going to talk about the relationship, some of the forecasting work that he's done, and I'll come back up and talk about the offsets. So at present, we have this legislation that says, look at the impact of transportation infrastructure on emissions, and in particular, look at capacity expansion projects. And so the procedure that we've set up underneath that to kind of satisfy that legislation and what would be required for new projects that are not yet in the STIP, the State Transportation Improvement Plan. So these are projects that are kind of 2027 and beyond.
would need to do this. First, they need to determine, is this project an expansion project, which is pretty straightforward. If it is, assess what the emissions impact of that project is beyond what the baseline conditions would be, and look at that over a 20-year period. And then also, if it is generating emissions, then identify a way of offsetting those through a program of other work, right? So I'll talk about each of those steps in a little bit more detail. First one is really simple. There's kind of two markers for, is it an expansion project? First one, is it a major project? Virtually all the work that we do these days fits in either of these categories: $15 million in a urban area, and then $5 million in other areas. So most of any project of significance is going to already hit this. And then is it either adding a lane of a half mile or more, or is it a new grade separated interchange? So those are the two things that we, in the main, are considering as expansion. Now, there's a number of project types that they may have an impact on emissions, but we're not considering to be expansion. So some of those listed up here: pavement rehabilitation, bridge replacement, intersection improvements that are not putting in a new grade separated interchange, active transportation infrastructure, some of our system improvements. So there's a suite of work that is not considered to be expansion. So first step, is it an expansion project? Yes, no, pretty straightforward to resolve that. And then step two, which I'll spend a little bit more time talking about each of these, is you have two options, or you have one requirement and you can do the other. So you're always meant to look at use the elasticity equation. Again, that's kind of going off the best advice that we have, that we're not picking up the induced travel demand that's created when you expand the highway network. And so apply, and it's actually a really simple equation that and I'll talk about the inputs then in a moment. And then if you want to go further, you can look at a travel demand forecast model and kind of validate that. But they're both of those methods are two different methods that are looking at the same thing. They're not going to have the same answer. They help to inform each other, and we're wanting those to kind of be within plus or minus 20% of each other. So this is a little bit more of a detailed diagram of how you walk through that step two, and kind of describes some of the inputs. So, if it's a lane addition project, all you need to really know is kind of the additional lane miles that you'd have. You're able to get our average daily vehicle counts, and from that you can derive what is the likely increase in vehicle miles traveled. You put that through a calculator that's based off of the MOVE's emissions factor, and boom, you get your emissions impact from a lane expansion. Or if it's an interchange, you would look at the travel time savings, kind of go through a similar exercise where, based on travel time savings, you're able to derive what is the increase in travel, apply that to the MOVE's calculator, boom, you get kind of a likely emissions factor. So those are the kind of what's involved in the second step. I'll have some links at the end of the presentation, and I'm sure I'll distribute it to the members afterwards. So this guidance is posted online. In addition to the guidance, we have a worksheet that you just walk through step by step, and so it's pretty clear, although we are still finding improvements to that. And so certainly if any of you are engaged in a project and applying this methodology, and you're like, oh, we've run into this wall, like, don't sit on it. We'd actually love to know that. So I'm very happy to work with you on it. So for both of those options, either the elasticity equation or the travel demand forecast model, you're comparing the build to the no build. You're trying to determine what's the volume of new vehicle miles that would be generated by that build scenario. You're going to convert that to tailpipe emissions, and you're going to look at those tailpipe emissions over 20 years. And again, the guidance is pretty clear. There's a little, very small link there at the bottom, again, which we can share out. So the elasticity equation, because this is kind of the newer thing, travel demand forecast models are a little bit kind of better known. Just a few of the factors that go into it. You're looking at, the additional lane miles in the area that are going to be built. You're then converting the new or the current VMT to what you're anticipating in the build scenario. And then you're applying this elasticity factor, which is, again, based on that research in urban areas. It's a factor of 1. And then you have kind of decreasing induced travel, particularly if you're like in a rural area where that effect is less observable or less noticeable. For intersections, as I kind of indicated, It's a slightly different method where the main derivative is, or the main thing you're looking at is travel time savings, and that then drives the what you'd find in terms of the induced travel from VMTs. And that also has the effect of an interchange is less powerful than new capacity, new lane miles. And so again, there's an elasticity that kind of reflects the research that we found in that area. So if you are so lucky to be a consultant helping one of your partners on a project, some of the data that you're going to need to acquire is just basics about the project, lane miles added. You're going to need to figure out the current VMT. We have data on our website that shows that. You're going to, for interchanges, you're going to look at the travel area that's affected by that interchange, kind of figure out the VMT for that area. Our travel demand forecasting office, it can assist you particularly on the interchanges. There's only going to be a handful of these that are coming through in any given year, and so they've agreed that they'll actually do some of this analysis for you. And again, you're going to come out, figure out what the travel time savings is for that. So again, that equation kind of throws people for a loop because like you have kind of four things, you plug it in, and half an hour later you have an answer, and you're like, what? So a lot of people are skeptical. It can't be that easy. That can't be right. And so we have lots of work that's been invested in our travel demand forecast models. And so particularly if your client's like, whoa, that seems like a lot of emissions generated from that lane addition, I don't believe it. Run a travel demand forecast model, and Paul will help you understand that.
Good. All right. Well, thanks, Maurice. So there's a number of efforts going on related to travel demand modeling here. So just wanted to kind of bring that into the equation. As Maurice described, really this is kind of a multi-pronged effort. There's things that travel demand models do really well in terms of understanding kind of how traffic is routing around the network and the ability to make more detailed predictions about mode shift and things like that. But there's also things that it doesn't do as well. For example, doesn't have dynamic land use, or it won't increase like the population growth in the area. So we're trying to find, kind of use the strengths of both while, sort of addressing the weaknesses that might exist out there. So I know this is a very technical group here, so probably some of this is a little bit of a refresher, but what is a travel demand forecast model? Basically, these are big mathematical models. You've probably heard people in your offices talk about, oh, it took like 3 days to run, a lot of calculations, but basically they've actually been around for a long time. I think they originated in like the 1960s when, the big expansion of the highway system was going on. And so that was really what, travel demand models were intended to do, is sort of where should we build the highways and how big should we make them? And the questions we're asking now in terms of these subtle, like kind of mode shift and induced demand things are a much like finer grain question that we're trying to answer. And so that is really pushing the limits of that, but it's also, triggering some of the needs to make the improvements that I'll mention here. So just kind of a quick primer on kind of what travel demand models are actually doing inside the black box. We start with the understanding that people and goods need to get places. Obviously that's what transportation is all about. And we have some ideas about kind of when and where they're going to do that. Now, the built environment kind of dictates or kind of sets like the needs of travel, whether those things are far apart from each other or close to each other. And, obviously, and then we conduct surveys to understand kind of where people go and spend their time. And then how they get there, they're making choices from the options available. And so that relies on some economics type equations, both in terms of what mode they choose and then what route they use along the network here. And so what's cool is then once we kind of done all that, now we can say, okay, when we can add all that up and say, okay, there's going to be this many cars driving on this segment of road, or there's going to be this many passengers on this bus at this time of day. And, those are kind of the answers that we're looking for to actually inform our design decisions. But just being able to replicate that, isn't terribly powerful, as cool as we might think it might be. The power is really that we can then change that. So if we want to say, well, what if we do more of something, or what if we improved something else, then, inevitably you're going to get a different answer. And it's a lot cheaper to answer those what if questions with the model than doing it in real life when you might be wrong. So just a couple other kind of facts to think about. All models have supply and demand. So again, borrowing some kind of economics terminology there, and they're really trying to kind of find that equilibrium. However, there's a huge range of the level of detail in travel demand models. And so some are very simple. And, I'll be talking about some of the small MPO models in Minnesota here in a moment. Many of those only really look at auto travel. Maybe they only have one time a day. Whereas if you look at the Twin Cities regional model, tons of detail because it's looking at, obviously a very large highway network, very large transit network, the interaction between those things. Of course, we have our managed lane system. And so then there's kind of the tolling aspect that goes with that. And so it just becomes this kind of rabbit hole that, as your transportation system gets more complex, your models have to, be able to inform that. The other thing I always like to remind folks, you've probably heard this quote before, all models are wrong, but some are useful. We do not expect to, perfectly replicate the world through these models. But the goal is that if we can capture some of the key things that we're interested in, they can help give us a better answer than we would have without doing it. So kind of the first project initiative I'll mention here is what was called the Regional Modeling Gap Analysis. And as part of the 2024 legislation that Maurice mentioned, the legislature made some funding available to the Greater Minnesota MPOs to improve their travel demand models to be able to perform better with respect to some of the GHG and VMT analysis that's part of this assessment process, both now with the project level assessment, but also in the future. We expect the needs for that is really going to grow as we start thinking about the portfolio assessment and as we get kind of further down that trend line of the reductions here. And so the St. Cloud APO and the Mankato Area Planning Organization were the MPOs that participated in this project. And so it was great to be able to help them improve their models. And so really the overarching goal was how do we make those models better with respect to the greenhouse gas emissions? And so we ended up really kind of doing a pretty focused effort on what matters. And so what matters, you might say? Well, as Maurice kind of alluded to, and this maybe just sheds a little more light on, that the emissions are really made up of two parts. There's the miles of travel, and then there's the emissions rate. And so the travel demand model obviously is going to give us that VMT answer, but there's more to it than just the specific, the cumulative miles that have been traveled, because the emissions do vary based on the speeds that the vehicles are going. And, sometimes somewhat counterintuitively, they actually have worse emissions profiles at really low speeds. And so that's why sometimes you hear folks talking about if we could reduce congestion, we could actually improve emissions. However, as you get into very high speeds, up above 60 miles an hour, it does actually start to tick up again. So kind of bringing it back to these model improvements, we're trying to, make those speed estimates as accurate as possible, in addition to that overall size of the VMT pie. So I'll just highlight a few of the improvements that were made to the St. Cloud APO's model here. There were probably even a little bit longer list than this, but I'll just mention a few of them. The first was what's called area type. And if you think about like the functional class of the roadway system, we have minor arterials all over the place, whether you're in urban area, suburban, or rural. And so the model doesn't necessarily understand, unless we tell it, that a minor arterial in downtown behaves differently than a minor arterial out in the suburban area or the undeveloped areas here. And so this used to be a really cumbersome process for the APO and folks that were using their model, because as the region continues to grow and kind of the suburban area takes over more of the previously undeveloped area, it was this manual process and you kind of had to figure it out. And so this was an effort to automate that so that as the population and employment density in the traffic analysis zones goes into that kind of more suburban level, the links just automatically are converted then to that more suburban profile here. And so you can see in the image on the right, seems to pass the smell test, for those that are familiar with St. Cloud in terms of where those different, land developments are. The other was what we call the volume delay function. So you'd probably recognize this from like the highway capacity manual. That's actually, part of how the models are predicting congestion.
it used to be, as shown on the left, that you could be at, well over 1.0 volume to capacity ratio, and the speed had just barely dipped down a couple miles per hour. And we all know as traffic engineers that that is totally unreasonable, that once you get above, a volume over capacity, your speed is going to drop like a rock. And so we actually use some of the information from the highway capacity manual to update those to the picture shown on the left, where you see that much steeper drop off, which again, is in service of more accurate estimates of the speeds on the links. We also updated the intersection delay. This is actually not a real common feature on a lot of travel demand models, that usually the delay and the travel times are just based on the links. But of course, again, as traffic engineers, we know that most of the delay is actually coming from the intersection performance and the conflicts that are present there. And so, this was a matter of, being able to actually understand, is there a signal there? Is it a stop sign there? And based on the vehicle conflicts, estimate the delay. I would note this effort is not for the faint of heart. I mean, you look at just the St. Cloud planning area has, several hundred, maybe even close to 1,000 intersections. Unfortunately, we were able to get that from the APO. But you think about extrapolating that out to an area like the Twin Cities metropolitan area, and there's a good reason why that step has not been taken here yet. Kind of the last set of updates that were made in St. Cloud was putting in a mode choice model. Now, I mentioned in my first couple remarks that the original travel demand models were like, where should we put the highways and how big should they be? And it probably comes as no surprise that the non-highway mode share in St. Cloud is like, I think it's less than 1% in terms of folks that use walking and biking or transit as their primary mode of travel. And so there really wasn't a lot of utility in sort of modeling those other modes, because it wasn't going to make any difference in terms of like answering the question of how big do the highways need to be. But now that we're asking different questions about mitigating, GHG and VMT impacts, those are answers that we're interested in. And so that, really triggered the need to have mode choice. The trick is that if you're going to create some variability between the modes, you actually have to model those other modes. And so there was an effort to update, the St. Cloud transit system into the model, and also provide a walking and biking network, which serves a couple functions. One, because that's how people get to the transit system in the first place. But we also, take into account folks that may actually make their entire trip using non-motorized modes. So again, just a couple highlights from some of the improvements to the St. Cloud model. The Mankato area planning area is totally different because they did not have a model at all. So we're starting from scratch. But fortunately, the folks from those planning organizations get along very well and actually try to kind of be efficient in terms of sharing their resources. And so the St. Cloud APO was more than happy to allow Mankato to basically use the guts of their model and then just layer on, the local detail in the Mankato and North Mankato area. And so that was really the effort that was undertaken here. And so one of the first steps was to, map out all of the traffic analysis zones that would be in the model. And we based those off of the census areas because, some of the key inputs there are the population and the employment. And the more that we can make that a one-to-one relationship with the census data, the easier it's going to be to update in the future. Similarly, with the highway network, some were able to import, based on shape files maintained for the highway system, and then layering on some other detail about the functional class and the speeds of the roadway, for example. And you'll see that this was very detailed. It actually went down all the way to the local system, particularly in the downtown areas here. And because that the different modes had already been set up for the St. Cloud model, it made sense to include the transit network in the Mankato area as well. So it does have that full operation in its very first version here, rather than the St. Cloud model, which, of course, has been around for decades already, and only now those additional modes have been added in. So the last piece of this project to help the MPOs improve their modeling was to add the GHG emissions estimation as part of that. And I won't, go into a ton of detail there, but we're pretty excited about this because you heard Maurice mention moves. That's, oh boy, don't quiz me on the exact acronym that stands for, but that's a model that's provided by the Environmental Protection Agency to estimate emissions of all kinds of pollutants from vehicle travel. And but it's in and of itself is like a pretty big, complicated model to run. And so rather than requiring an analyst to have to go in and rerun that model every time, basically what we're doing is just running that model for the Mankato and St. Cloud areas like every year for the next 30 years, and then hard coding that data into this model. And so being able to estimate the GHG emissions is really just a matter of, it's just one additional step. Once the travel demand model is done running, it's in the same software. And so that should really make that more efficient and easier going forward. So last thing I want to touch on here is talk about a statewide travel demand model. This is not something that MnDOT or the state of Minnesota has ever had before. And while it's been considered on a few instances here, it really wasn't until the GHG and VMT analysis kind of came onto the scene that finally there was a critical mass of folks that were like, all right, this makes sense for us to have. We're going to be doing some pretty significant planning around these topics here, and that would be a good reason to have the model. And so we did some investigation into, kind of what is the landscape of statewide models across the country. And maybe we're a little bit surprised to learn that Minnesota is actually in the minority of states that do not have a model. There's probably about 2/3 actually do. And so, that's always a little extra motivation to be like, we don't want to be left behind. But we also learned some good lessons from those other states in terms of kind of what works, what doesn't work, and what they use their models for. We also had a workshop with a bunch of stakeholders representing MnDOT and other public sector agencies here to kind of give them an indication of what some of the ideas were for the travel demand model, but more importantly, to get feedback on what they might want to use it for, because the GHG and VMT work is not the only game in town. We would hope that there'd be other applications for it, given the pretty significant investment that would be going into that. And the group did not disappoint. It was a pretty lengthy list of ideas. And so I think the good news is that as the model is developed and comes online, it should have a very rich, kind of customer base, if you will, of kind of downstream users of those results. We also polled the workshop on kind of what are the things that are most important about that model. And far and away, the one that was highest there was the interaction between land use and transportation. I think a lot of this kind of goes back to some of those ideas that Maurice mentioned about induced demand and kind of how do the transportation decisions we make then influence other elements of, growth and development patterns and kind of the urban fabric here. And then you can see some of the other ones are, transit, active transportation. And, it kind of struck me that I was like, oh my gosh, we've come a long way from answering questions about where should we put the highways and how big should they be. There's a lot of pressure on this model now to be able to do some things that, travel demand models have not traditionally been associated with. Well, working with that input, we did develop some recommendations that were submitted to MnDOT a little over a year ago here. And now, the pieces are kind of moving forward here, but kind of two big pieces. One is thinking about a 2-track model structure. So certainly a travel demand model is one of those, but there's also something we would call a strategic planning model, which is something that it's even at a higher level. It's not going to give you those pictures or kind of what we call like the spider diagrams where you can see traffic actually driving through the network, but it could answer bigger picture questions about if we had more high density housing, how might people make different travel decisions? Or if we provided economic incentives or disincentives to different travel decisions, how might that impact behavior? And it's actually a lot more efficient to answer those kind of questions with a tool like that, as opposed to running a big statewide model that's going to take days to give you an answer. The other feature of the recommendations was something we called working backwards. And I think it's probably easier to illustrate that visually than in words here. So Vision Eval is a specific example of one of these strategic planning models, and it's something MnDOT already has in use, but we certainly recommend that they continue using that here. When we talk about working backwards, what we mean by that is actually starting the model development process with the step that comes at the end of the model. And what that means, what we call that is highway assignment. So that's where we actually figure out, okay, of all the trips that are going to be made by cars and trucks, how are they going to route onto the highway network? And in some ways, it's easier to just jump right to that point because we can measure it with like GPS data and essentially just download that for existing conditions here. And then be able to make some tweaks to that as we either think about expansion projects on the network, whereas not worrying about some of the kind of the upstream like behavioral choices that would lead to that. In the near term, we could also think about extrapolating those trips out into the future, programming in, and projects that we anticipate on the highway system, and then being able to at least draw some initial conclusions about that, before we have that full model, because the full model part, is a much more extensive process. There's going to need to be travel surveys done, a lot of work that would go into that. You're probably looking at at least a 1 to 2 year time to develop that. Meanwhile, we can at least be making some progress on some of our GHG and VMT estimation by having kind of those end processes while the rest of the model is developed here. In the long term, one thing we think would be really cool is to develop a relationship actually from that strategic planning model into the travel demand models. So again, thinking about that idea of economic incentives or other kind of behavior change, being able to kind of include that in the estimation when we know that travel demand models aren't necessarily the best at doing that. And finally, we do have some examples from other states where they even have other kinds of models, economic models, population growth, freight, that will take a longer time to build, certainly beyond that kind of 2 to 3 year window, but ultimately could give us some really powerful tools to make some predictions about the future here. So thanks for listening to hear a little bit about the travel demand models, and I'll invite Maurice back to finish up with the mitigations.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I'll close with, I started my portion of the presentation talking about how we'd be assessing those expansion projects, and then related in legislation to it is like, okay, well, if you are doing an expansion project and you're found to be generating emissions from that, we want you to identify ways to offset that. So one of the things that kind of put up front on this is it's not easy, and I think that that's intentional. Like the legislature, when they enacted this legislation, there was a strong push saying we don't want to just keep expanding our trunk highway network ad infinitum. And so one of the logical questions, like, well, if we can offset the emissions impact, and particularly offset the travel that's being generated, why do we need to do the project to start with? So there is that bit of gravity, but there will be instances where the project makes sense for whatever reason, and that mitigation might be a more effective approach. And so in addition to identifying methodology for how we would assess the emissions impact of an expansion project, here's some methods that we have for how you could identify offsetting actions to that. So first thing is that the legislation asks that you try to keep those offsets local. So that's something to consider as you're developing offset plans for projects you might be promoting. And that makes a lot of sense because oftentimes, the community that is both receiving the expansion project, they would also want to receive the benefits of some of the offsetting like transit or active travel stuff, as opposed to funding that in a different community. And so there's going to be a desire there. In some of your smaller communities, though, you're going to struggle to find those offsets in that area, and so you can legislation allows you to go wider. There are 10 kind of categories that the legislation identifies, ranging from transit expansion to transit service improvements, active travel, micromobility. I won't read all of them, but there's 10 categories of offsets, and then within each of those, we've identified 3 to 9 different techniques. And so at present, we've developed kind of methodology for, I want to say like 45 techniques, but it's also not an exhaustive list. We're always open to, if a project proponent, municipality, you name it, has an innovative way, something that we haven't thought of offsetting, we're open to that. As a real like, for instance, some of our rural communities, you may find that you can reduce travel by actually just keeping some of the amenities local. So if you're able to keep a, an after hours or emergency clinic or school in your community, as opposed to sending everyone, 15 miles down the road, that's not one of the techniques we have up here, but we're open to that as, as an option. So it is pushing project proponents to think more broadly. We're asking them to think not just about the expansion project itself, but kind of a range of counter balancing actions. And some of those are not within the traditional wheelhouse of transportation, like land use. That is something that requires partnership with the cities and counties. So we have developed something that was initially actually kind of predated the legislation as it relates to the emissions reduction legislation, called the carbon emissions tool. This was set up as a way of enabling some money that was flowing in through the carbon reduction programs and federal money. So we had developed this tool already, and we've now kind of expanded it, and it also applies to this work. So it's at this point, it's a spreadsheet-based tool. We're currently working with the state's IT department to set up a interactive web-based application for it. But at present, and again, there'll be links at the end of the presentation. There's a spreadsheet, and allows you to just quickly plug in the top. Again, you won't be able to see it from the image, but there's only a few data inputs that you kind of really need to throw in. And then if you believe that there's more context and specificity that you can provide, there are a few inputs that are optional that you can make it more specific, but then it really clearly kind of shows you across the 20 years, what offsets you would anticipate. So this is just kind of zooming in. This was a active travel one. So, for it, there are kind of, you need 4 inputs to kind of get an answer. You can put in 6 more if you want to, get more specificity out of your particular application. And then it shows you the results. And so again, this is something that you can quite quickly do. And so even if you're kind of helping a client think through a project at a sketch level, you can quickly work up what might be some options in terms of how they could think about offsetting. There are, in dark green, there are a few categories that are newer to us that we haven't yet developed out. So this is a continuous improvement, and one of our next phases is to develop techniques that people can plug into in that carbon emissions tool. But again, not exhaustive. And so if people are creative and have other things that are not on the list, we're open to that. We'd love to hear about it. So when assessing the impacts of an expansion project and then also identifying the offsets, the reason why we're being asked to do that is that the legislation says it can't go into the state transportation improvement program if you haven't done this analysis and if you haven't offset those impacts. And so who is who's responsible for making those assessments? So in the first instance, the project proponent is the person that's or the group that's going to do the analysis. Yep, it's an expansion project, and we've looked at it and we think this is both the impacts, and here's what we think could be the offsets. And that is going to require kind of partnership coordination with a number of partners. So this is, while it's a new area, it's not new. Many of our transportation projects are complicated and require many funding streams and coordination across different entities. But the people that would first up say like, yep, we agree it's an expansion project and we agree that you've offset it or considered it appropriately, would be, in the case of MPOs, it would be the MPOs that would consider that, like my council would be the Transportation Advisory Board. They receive information from the project proponent for that kind of worksheet that we talked about on a consistent front, like, yep, we agree you've done the analysis and it's either going in or it's not going in. And then MnDOT, through that technical advisory committee, at least in the first few years, we'd be reviewing those expansion projects going in just to validate both, yep, we think that they did the analysis well, right, but then also because we might find like, oh, there's gaps in how we've applied this guidance and things that we could do better upon review. So again, the MPO will be, if it's within an MPO area, they'll be the first entity to approve it. If it's outside of that, MnDOT through the districts would be the entity that would be assessing whether or not the guidance has been adhered to. Just real briefly, just now kind of applying this to a new interchange, as for instance. So we've looked at a number of past interchanges, and we're kind of generally finding that once you many interchanges will kind of generate 2 million miles of extra VMT per year. Ran through that moves calculator, added up of 20 years, you're kind of looking at 11,000 metric tons. One of my improvements, I want to figure out how many trees this relates to, like, yeah, just give some. So I don't know exactly how much 11,000 metric tons of carbon is, but it's a lot. So then we'd be looking for that if, like, yep, we're committed to doing this expansion project. We're committed to that, and so therefore we're going to find some offsets. Here's just kind of back of the envelope. We looked at a few of those categories: transit expansion, transit service improvement, where you're converting some of the fleet to electric, bike facility, and then a land use change. And you come up to. Now, again, I'm kind of making this look a little bit easy. I do know that offsets, particularly for lane expansions, are not going to be easy. So I don't think it's going to be, we'll magically work our way out of this. And I do think, like, through time, MnDOT and others will kind of learn more about us, and we'll kind of continue to refine how we're seeking to apply this. And that relates to my last point, which is that this is a new developing area for work. Like when yesterday, I was at the Transportation Alliance, and there were other MnDOT people kind of presenting, and they're talking about programs that we're still kind of getting set up, 10 years after they've been initiated, 15 years. This is a big change for our transportation planning and thinking. And so it's going to take some time for us to work through this. So I've described the kind of first cab off the rank, which was looking at projects. But our next step, and what we're just starting to get to, is like, how do we apply that to a portfolio? And that will have some pros and cons in terms of we'd have a bigger pool of projects to look at when we're doing offsets, but we also may have a bigger denominator to work with in terms of the projects that are generating emissions. Looking to do more outreach. We're trying to do more scenario testing to look at how this applies in real life. Continue looking to refine our methodology. We continue to get more information from transportation research community, and so therefore truing up some of our methods. And again, the big one is kind of moving to that portfolio analysis, which is, what do we mean by portfolio? How do we want to track offsets? I don't know. We're still working that out. So that's to come, but that's a very common question that we get. Certainly, I would say in the first instance, if you're working on a project or with a client that has a project, ask you to kind of do that individually within the project. Look at the project and then start to identify what offsets, what specific projects you might pair up with that. In time, we'll probably work to some accounting system around that, but the details of that we're still working on. And so the last couple pieces of advice, a kind of key message, for all of you as your assisting clients or our clients, plan early. This requires more collaboration, and so start collaborating with partners. You want to start thinking about what those offsetting actions are and thinking about those in the scope of the project, because funding will need to also come somewhere for those. And the aspiration, again, is to kind of create this balanced system where we're not just adding capacity and thinking that it magically doesn't have any effects. So, and then lastly, and this is probably more my request of you, be proactive, seek assistance. We're learning just as the rest of the transportation community is on this. And so the more we hear from people about specific projects, oh, we hadn't thought about that instance, or yeah, you've run into a dead end and our guidance doesn't address that. Well, you're right, but we'll go to work on that. So we welcome being involved in that. A few resources. So certainly my team and MnDOT, we're in the central office. We can assist and be involved. But then also, I know that your district planners and engineers will be greatly interested in this too. So in some ways, I'd start almost with your district MnDOT staff in the first instance, and then they'll pull us in. Some of the tools that I was mentioning, that first link is that assessment guidance, which tells you how to walk through the methodology for assessing the impacts of an expansion project. That emissions tool, the one that kind of calculates the offsets, that's the second link. And then if you're looking, just I want to see what the legislation says and get more information, we have that there. So with that, I will conclude, and I guess we take questions. Is that right, Mr. Madam Chair? Any questions? Or if not, we're happy to chat over drinks later on.
Seems like the
VMT is related to GHG. Like you see like a, excuse me, you see like higher GHG with VMT. So what's like the primary reason for, tracking both of those? You said.
So the emissions impact is calculated based off of the increase in VMT that a project is generating. So they go 1-to-1, right? The legislation didn't kind of go into this as much depth, like in addition to those emissions reduction targets, as a way of kind of bending the curve, the legislation is also seeking for us to over time have like a per capita decrease in VMT. So even though like your population would go up and then therefore the aggregate VMT would go up, they're kind of wanting the amount of each person that's driving to be reduced, and thereby having less emissions. So it's a little bit of a complicated scenario, and one of the things we're having to work through is one of our next step is like what portion of the total emissions are we going to try to apply to our expansion projects versus changes in fuel type and stuff. But there's certainly, again, is a recognition that the infrastructure that we're building does have an impact on how much people are driving and therefore emissions. And so we're trying to account for that portion of it. Paul, if you wanted to say anything else around that.
I think maybe just to emphasize the point that the state does have a VMT reduction goal in addition to the GHG reduction goal. And those are different, both in terms of like the magnitude and the, kind of the starting point. But the VMT reduction goal came out of the Sustainable Transportation Committee, well, I don't know, 5 years ago or 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. And while the climate, rationale for that was a big reason for that VMT reduction, there were a lot of other reasons that committee made that recommendation. Things like safety, congestion, just like the size of the transportation network in general. And so that's, I think, just getting to kind of Maurice's point that you could probably whack off a lot of the GHG with, just moving to electrified vehicles, and other solutions like that. But there's other reasons that I think the state's interested in the VMT reduction.
Yeah, and I would say like kind of in a weird way, my sense is like if you polled at least MnDOT staff on this, like even though the GHG reduction is like a very aggressive target, in some ways getting people to drive less given land use patterns and like those are locked in place for many years. In some ways that's even a more difficult target to achieve than the reducing emissions would be my sense. Other questions from the room or online folk? Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. I'm curious because this is a project oriented, initially kind of initiative. Are you finding as it does this greenhouse gas model starts to become applied to project specifically? Are you finding any unexpected incentives in the development process, or how you maybe define what the product is? Is it creating anything that maybe is unexpected in kind of navigating these hurdles? And then is that or I'm interested in how that maybe translate upstream, even as you start to maybe plan on projects that's informing decision making.
Yeah, so the question for the benefit of people online was asking about are we kind of seeing some unintended effects relative to planning, and what are some of the upstream benefits beyond just transportation network planning, like what do we see from that? So I'll offer just probably my opinions. There's no definitive answer on this, but just a couple things that observed. So one thing that's really kind of interesting is that we get at this point in the process, we get all these questions about, how are we going to account for the offsets, and those offsets are mine, and the Hennepin County's been building them, and so therefore they're going to go to our projects. And so the weird thing that we kind of see about this is that maybe some of these other transportation modes or alternatives that were less valuable, people are like, oh, there's a lot of value in that bike ped lane that we hadn't considered. And so in a weird way, it's this odd virtuous circle of making those things more valuable. I'm not going to say that this needing to offset is going to carry the day, and suddenly people are going to be doing those projects just for that reason alone. But in a weird way, it's kind of made people's attention on those other investment types. I don't know, they're more focused on it. I also think that it will probably drive greater cohesion between our transportation planning and our land use planning. Like I used to work for Metro Transit and therefore, arm of Met Council, and some of the land use long range planning is somewhat disconnected from the transportation planning. And then other smaller MPOs don't have as much of a divide, and so you can see this kind of pushing those two to be more cohesive. And then just lastly, again, to kind of circle back to that overarching observation that it really pushes people to think broadly, think more collaboratively, as opposed to I'm just looking at, getting this piece of infrastructure in and asking, people to do more related to that. So just a few observations. Do you have anything else?
Well, Tim's good question. In terms of unexpected results, we're all still waiting for that because no project has actually, initiated the assessment process yet. So we're all kind of waiting with bated breath here to kind of see how it turns out. One thing I'm particularly interested in is, Maurice showed that list of the 10 offset categories, and with the note that it's probably not exhaustive. But you'll see that a lot of those are infrastructure based. So building multi-use trails or expanding transit service or other improvements of that nature. All of those things cost money. And when we think about, a lot of the expansion projects on the trunk highway system right now, many are led by local units of government, and they are really stretching their dollars to make that work, sometimes cobbling together 8, 10, 12 different, funding sources. And so the idea that you're going to have, extra millions of dollars to spend on that is going to be certainly a challenge. However, there were a couple things on that list that don't necessarily cost money. And I'm thinking about the land use changes in particular. Now, that doesn't mean it's free from a level of effort perspective, because there's a long runway to, work with the communities in their comp planning process and kind of understand what it means to have like higher density or, more pedestrian or transit oriented development. But if cost is an issue and you need those offsets, maybe that's a way to get there that doesn't have that sort of capital price tag.
Great. Any last questions before I turn it back over to the moderator in our social networking hour? Well, again, I certainly welcome anybody that wants to get more information. Happy to reach out to me and look forward to chatting with you. So back to AJ.
Yeah, thank you guys. All right, the rest of our evening is hanging out, socializing, drinking beer. So we're already halfway there. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. You'll be getting an email after tonight with a PDH slip, and then we'll be sure to send out the resources that Maurice mentioned and probably a copy of the presentation. If that's okay with you guys. So thanks again.